In the summer of 1971, the quiet coastal community of Monterey Bay was unsettled by the disappearance of a child. She had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a pair of small sandals pressed into the sand. But 25 years later, when hurricane winds stripped away layers of protective dune, they uncovered a truth so devastating it would unravel the very fabric of a family's memory and lead to the most horrifying revelation imaginable. The story began on a Tuesday morning in June, when 12-year-old Susan Martinez stepped out of her father's station wagon and breathed in the salt-tinged air of the family's beach house. The two-story Victorian sat perched on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, its weathered shingles silvered by decades of ocean spray. Susan had spent every summer here since she could walk, and the house felt like a second home. "Mija, you're getting so tall," came the familiar voice from the front porch. Rosa Delgado emerged from the shadows of the wraparound veranda, her small frame draped in a simple cotton dress, her graying hair pulled back in its customary bun. She had worked for the Martinez family for 8 years, maintaining the beach house year-round with meticulous care. Susan ran to embrace the woman who had become like a grandmother to her. Rosa's arms felt thin but strong, and she smelled of lemon polish and lavender soap. "I've been waiting for you," Rosa murmured, her accent soft and musical. "The house has been too quiet without you." As Susan's parents unloaded suitcases, Rosa guided the girl inside. The familiar interior welcomed them: polished hardwood floors, antique furniture passed down through 3 generations, and Rosa's fresh-cut flowers arranged in crystal vases throughout the rooms. Everything appeared exactly as it should be, maintained with Rosa's usual devotion. "I've prepared your room," Rosa said, leading Susan up the narrow staircase. "And I've been saving something special for you." From her apron pocket, she produced a small seashell necklace, its surface smooth and iridescent. The pendant bore tiny carved initials, RD. "It's beautiful," Susan whispered, touching the shell gently. "My grandmother made it for me when I was your age," Rosa explained, fastening the delicate chain around Susan's neck. "Now it's yours to keep safe." Susan smiled, unaware that this simple gift would one day become the key to unraveling everything she thought she knew about the woman she trusted most. 3 weeks into that golden summer, Susan had settled into the rhythm of beach life. Her days blended together in a haze of salt air and sun-warmed sand, punctuated by Rosa's gentle calls to meals and the distant sound of hammering from Craig Morrison's repairs around the property. The handyman had been working steadily since their arrival, fixing loose boards and painting trim with his usual methodical precision. On the evening of July 15th, Susan announced her intention to take a sunset walk along the beach. The ritual had become sacred to her, those solitary moments when the dying light painted the waves in shades of amber and rose. "Don't go too far, Mija," Rosa called from the kitchen window where she was washing the dinner dishes. "The tide comes in fast after dark." Susan waved acknowledgement and stepped through the beach gate, her bare feet finding the familiar path down the bluff. The sand was still warm from the day's heat, and she could hear the rhythmic whisper of waves against the shore. In the distance, she glimpsed Mark Henley from the neighboring property throwing a tennis ball for his dog. He raised his hand in a tentative wave, which she ignored. The beach stretched empty in both directions, a pristine ribbon of sand bordered by rolling dunes. Susan walked south toward the rocky outcropping, where she often collected shells, her cotton sundress fluttering in the evening breeze. Behind her, the beach house grew smaller, its windows beginning to glow with lamplight as darkness approached. When Susan failed to return by 9 o'clock, her mother began pacing the front porch. By 10, her father was calling her name into the growing darkness. At 11, they contacted the sheriff. The search began immediately. Flashlight beams swept the beach like fallen stars, and voices echoed across the water. They found her sandals first, a pair of worn leather sandals placed neatly side by side just above the tide line, as if she had simply stepped out of them and vanished into the sea. But there were no footprints leading into the water, no signs of struggle in the sand, no trace of Susan Martinez except for those empty shoes sitting like a question mark against the vastness of the Pacific. Rosa stood at the edge of the search area, her rosary beads clicking softly between her fingers, her face etched with what appeared to be genuine anguish. The investigation that followed cast a harsh light on the shadows that had always lurked around the Martinez property. Within hours, 3 figures emerged as the primary focus of the sheriff's inquiry, each carrying secrets that made them seem capable of the unthinkable. Craig Morrison, the handyman, became the first suspect when deputies discovered his van parked behind the guest cottage at midnight hours after Susan's disappearance. His explanation that he was retrieving tools crumbled when they found a silver picture frame from the main house hidden beneath his work tarp. Under questioning, Craig's weathered face turned ashen as more stolen items were uncovered: a jade figurine, an antique letter opener, several pieces of jewelry. He had been systematically looting the Martinez family for months. "Maybe the girl saw something she shouldn't have," muttered Deputy Barnes, watching Craig's hands shake as he signed his statement. The second suspect lived even closer to danger. Mark Henley, 17 and gangly, had spent the summer hovering around the Martinez property with the persistence of a moth drawn to flame. His infatuation with Susan was painfully obvious. He timed his beach walks to coincide with hers, left wildflowers on her family's gate, and had been seen watching her bedroom window with binoculars. "She won't talk to me," Mark had complained to his older brother just days before Susan vanished. "She acts like I don't exist." The desperation in his voice carried the bitter edge of rejection. The third and most mysterious figure was James Hayes, who rented the small guest cottage. Hayes claimed to be a traveling salesman, but he received no mail, made no phone calls, and his references proved impossible to verify. He paid his rent in cash and avoided eye contact with disturbing consistency. When questioned about his whereabouts during Susan's disappearance, his alibi was vague and unconvincing. As deputies searched each suspect's quarters, Rosa moved quietly through the main house, brewing coffee for the investigators and offering quiet comfort to Susan's distraught parents. She seemed to anticipate their needs before they voiced them, appearing with blankets when someone shivered with tissues when tears began to fall. "That poor sweet child," she whispered to Detective Reynolds, her voice breaking with emotion. "Who would hurt such an innocent girl?" What the detective didn't notice was how Rosa's eyes never quite met his when she spoke, or how she somehow knew to avoid the exact stretch of beach where the search was concentrating. In the days following Susan's disappearance, Rosa Delgado became the family's anchor in a storm of chaos and grief. While detectives tramped through the house and reporters gathered at the gates, she maintained an island of calm efficiency that seemed to hold the entire household together. She anticipated Mrs. Martinez's needs with uncanny precision, appearing with sedatives before the doctor prescribed them, knowing to close curtains before the television crews arrived. When Mr. Martinez couldn't eat, Rosa prepared the exact soup his mother used to make a recipe she claimed to have learned by watching from the kitchen doorway during previous summers. "I don't know what we'd do without you," Mrs. Martinez sobbed into Rosa's shoulder on the third day. Rosa's embrace was steady and warm, her voice a soothing murmur of Spanish prayers and gentle reassurances. But it was Rosa's knowledge of the 3 suspects that proved most helpful to the investigation. She provided Detective Reynolds with detailed observations about Craig's comings and goings, mentioning specific dates when she'd noticed him near the house after hours. She described Mark's obsessive behavior with disturbing accuracy, recalling conversations she claimed to have overheard through thin cottage walls. Most remarkably, she seemed to know intimate details about the mysterious Mr. Hayes. "He never sleeps through the night," she told detectives, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I hear him pacing at all hours, and he asks too many questions about the family's schedule." When asked how she could hear Hayes pacing from her quarters above the main house, Rosa's explanation was seamless. "Sound carries differently near the ocean, and I'm a light sleeper. I worry about the property when the family isn't here." She organized the search volunteers with military precision, preparing sandwiches and coffee with portions calculated exactly. She knew which beach areas had been covered and which still needed attention, information that impressed even the seasoned deputies. "That woman has eyes everywhere," Deputy Barnes commented to his partner. "Nothing happens on this property without her knowing about it." What he meant as a compliment would later take on a far more sinister meaning. Rosa's vigilance wasn't just devotion, it was surveillance. And her perfect knowledge of everyone's movements hadn't come from caring observation, but from careful planning of something far more calculated than anyone could imagine. 25 years passed like sand through an hourglass, leaving behind only faded memories and unanswered questions. The Martinez family had sold the beach house in 1973, unable to bear the weight of its ghosts. New owners came and went, each unaware of the tragedy that had stained the property's history. Rosa Delgado had disappeared shortly after the investigation concluded. She claimed her grief was too great to continue working at the scene of such heartbreak, and the family, drowning in their own sorrow, had let her go with generous severance and glowing references. In October of 1996, Hurricane Francine roared up the California coast with unprecedented fury. The storm surge reached heights not seen in decades, and winds exceeding 90 miles per hour reshaped the coastline in a single night. When dawn broke over Monterey Bay, the familiar dunes behind the Martinez property had been carved away like soft butter, exposing layers of earth that had remained hidden for a quarter century. It was a jogger who made the discovery. Dr. Sarah Chen was picking her way carefully around the newly exposed cliff face when she noticed something white protruding from the dark soil. What she initially mistook for driftwood revealed itself to be far more sinister, the unmistakable curve of a human skull, small and delicate, wrapped in the rotted remains of a cotton sundress. The call to the sheriff's department brought Detective Michael Torres to the scene within the hour. Torres had grown up hearing stories about the Martinez girl, and he recognized the significance immediately. But what truly stunned him was what else the hurricane had revealed. Scattered around the shallow grave like accusations made manifest were 3 distinct pieces of evidence. Craig Morrison's red metal toolbox lay half buried nearby, its contents long since corroded but its ownership unmistakable. His name was still visible on a faded piece of masking tape. Mark Henley's class ring from Monterey High School gleamed dully in the sand, its distinctive blue stone catching the morning light. Most damning of all was a waterlogged wallet containing fake identification papers in the name of James Hayes, along with what appeared to be a driver's license bearing a completely different name and photograph. The storm had done what 25 years of investigation could not. It had served up the evidence needed to finally understand Susan Martinez's fate. Or so it seemed to Detective Torres as he carefully photographed each item, unaware that the most crucial piece of evidence lay hidden beneath what appeared to be a simple shell necklace. The red toolbox that emerged from Susan Martinez's makeshift grave seemed to answer questions that had haunted investigators for decades. Detective Torres carefully pried open the corroded latches, revealing the ghostly remnants of Craig Morrison's livelihood: rusted hammers, twisted screwdrivers, and a tape measure that had once been yellow but now resembled aged parchment. But it was what lay beneath the tools that made Torres's pulse quicken. Wrapped in what had once been an oil-stained rag were 3 pieces of jewelry: a pearl bracelet, a gold locket, and a sapphire ring. The Martinez family's insurance records, pulled from storage after 25 years, confirmed these were among the items reported stolen from the house during the summer of 1971. Morrison killed her to keep her quiet. Torres concluded, photographing each piece of evidence with methodical precision. She must have caught him stealing, and he couldn't risk exposure. The scenario wrote itself with tragic simplicity. Craig Morrison, a man with a drinking problem and mounting debts, had been systematically looting the family he was supposed to protect. When 12-year-old Susan stumbled upon his theft, panic overcame reason. A struggle, an accident, a moment of terrible decision, and then the long walk to the dunes to bury both the girl and the evidence of his crimes. The case file from 1971 supported this theory. Craig had been the last person to admit seeing Susan alive, claiming he'd spotted her heading toward the beach around sunset. His van had been parked behind the guest cottage that night, positioned perfectly for transporting a small body to the burial site. Most damning of all, he had disappeared from Monterey Bay just 3 weeks after the investigation concluded, leaving no forwarding address. Yet something nagged at Torres as he studied the burial site. The grave was too neat, too carefully constructed for a panicked killer. The body had been positioned with an almost ritual care. Susan's arms folded across her chest, a small pillow of sand supporting her head. This wasn't the hasty work of a desperate thief. It was the measured act of someone who had time to think, to plan, to say goodbye. When Torres called the Martinez family to inform them of the discovery, he also tracked down Rosa Delgado. She had moved to Sacramento after leaving the beach house, working for 3 different families over the decades. Her voice on the phone carried the same musical accent, the same gentle cadence he remembered from the old case files. "Ay, Dios mío," she whispered when he told her about Craig's toolbox. I always knew that man was trouble. Poor little Susan, she was too trusting, too innocent for this world. Mark Henley's class ring told a story that seemed ripped from the darkest corners of teenage obsession. The gold band with its distinctive blue stone had been photographed extensively during the original investigation. Mark had worn it constantly, twisting it around his finger whenever he spoke about Susan, which was often. Detective Torres pulled the old witness statements and found a pattern that chilled him. Mark had kept a detailed diary during the summer of 1971, documenting every interaction with Susan down to the minute. Talked to S for 37 seconds at the mailbox. She smiled when I mentioned the wildflowers. Watched S reading on the beach for 2 hours. She looked up once and saw me. I think she likes the attention. The entries grew increasingly disturbing as Susan continued to ignore his advances. She acts like she's better than me. All the other girls at school think I'm cute. Why won't she even look at me? The final entry, dated July 14th, one day before Susan's disappearance, contained a single line that made Torres's blood run cold. If I can't have her, maybe nobody should. Mark's alibi had always been suspect. He claimed to be in his room reading, but his mother had been at her bridge club that evening and his father was traveling for business. No one could verify his whereabouts between 8 and 11 p.m., the crucial window when Susan vanished. More damning still were the statements from other teenagers who had encountered Mark that summer. Jennifer Walsh, now a mother of 3 living in Portland, remembered a conversation from the beach volleyball courts. Mark kept talking about how Susan was his girl, even though everyone knew she wanted nothing to do with him. He said if she ever tried to leave Monterey, he'd find a way to stop her. The physical evidence supported a confrontation scenario. The ring hadn't simply fallen from Mark's finger. Forensic analysis suggested it had been torn away, possibly during a struggle. Scratches on the metal were consistent with fingernails, and trace amounts of what might have been dried blood lingered in the setting's crevices. When Torres contacted Rosa again to ask about Mark's behavior that summer, her memory proved remarkably detailed. "That boy was always lurking around," she said, her voice heavy with disapproval. "I told Susan to stay away from him, but she was too polite to be rude. I should have been firmer with her." What Torres didn't question was how Rosa knew about interactions between Mark and Susan that supposedly happened when Rosa was inside the house, or why her warnings to Susan were never mentioned in any of the original statements. Sometimes, the most revealing clues hide in the spaces between what people remembered to say. The wallet containing James Hayes's identification papers revealed the most disturbing truth yet. Beneath layers of salt-stained leather, Detective Torres discovered documentation for a man who had never existed. The Social Security number belonged to a child who had died in infancy in 1943. The birth certificate was a sophisticated forgery. Even the driver's license photograph, though water-damaged, clearly showed a different man entirely. The real identity behind the Hayes facade belonged to Robert Chen Valdez, a drifter with a criminal record spanning 3 states. His rap sheet included charges for stalking, breaking, and entering, and what the files euphemistically termed inappropriate contact with minors. He had been released from a Nevada prison just 4 months before, renting the Martinez guest cottage. This guy was a professional predator, Torres told his partner, studying the mugshots that showed a man with dead eyes and a practiced smile. He picked that cottage specifically because it gave him access to the family. The guest cottage sat just 50 yards from the main house, positioned with clear sight lines to Susan's bedroom window. During the original investigation, deputies had found makeshift curtains that blocked the view from outside, but they hadn't considered that someone might be watching from within. A set of binoculars discovered in Hayes's belongings suddenly took on sinister significance. Most chilling of all was a journal hidden beneath Hayes's mattress, filled with detailed observations about Susan's daily routine. Subject rises at 7:30 a.m., breakfast at 8 at Sandals. Beach walk, typically 6:30 to 7:45 p.m., always alone. Parents retire by 10:00 p.m. The clinical language made Torres's skin crawl. This wasn't infatuation like Mark's diary, but the methodical planning of a predator. Hayes had vanished the same night as Susan, leaving behind rent paid through the end of July and belongings that suggested a hasty departure. His story about being a traveling salesman now seemed like calculated cover for a man who specialized in inserting himself into vulnerable situations. When Torres called Rosa to ask about Hayes's behavior during his tenancy, her recollections were unnervingly precise. "He asked too many questions about when the family would be away," she said. "And I caught him watching the house through his window more than once. I told Susan to never go near that cottage alone." "Did you report these concerns to the family at the time?" Torres asked. There was a pause before Rosa answered. "I mentioned it to Mr. Martinez, but he said I was being overprotective. I should have been more insistent." Her voice carried what sounded like genuine regret, but Torres found himself wondering how Rosa had managed to observe Hayes window watching from her quarters above the main house, especially at night. 3 weeks into the renewed investigation, Detective Torres found himself staring at a whiteboard covered with evidence that should have felt like victory. 3 suspects, 3 pieces of damning evidence, 3 clear motives. Yet something fundamental wasn't adding up. The first inconsistency emerged when the medical examiner completed her analysis of Susan's remains. Dr. Patricia Marsh, who had handled hundreds of similar cases, delivered her findings with characteristic precision. The skeletal trauma suggests a single blow to the back of the head with a smooth, rounded object, not consistent with any of the tools found in Morrison's box. Torres studied the crime scene photographs again. Craig's toolbox contained hammers, but they were claw hammers with distinctive striking surfaces that would have left different fracture patterns. The injury that killed Susan looked more like it came from something blunt and heavy, a rock perhaps, or a household object. The second problem was geographical. A careful survey of the burial site revealed it sat nearly 200 yards from the beach path where Susan's sandals were found. For a 12-year-old girl to have walked that distance barefoot over rough dune grass seemed unlikely, especially in the dark. More puzzling still, the medical examiner found no sand or debris between Susan's toes that would indicate she had walked the distance herself. "Someone carried her here," Dr. Marsh concluded. "The burial site was chosen deliberately, probably scouted in advance." But the most troubling inconsistency came from the timeline itself. Torres had reconstructed the movements of all 3 suspects on the night of July 15th, and none of them had unaccounted time after 9 p.m. when the search for Susan began. Craig's van had been spotted by neighbors returning from the main road at 8:45. Mark had been seen by his girlfriend's family during a phone call that lasted from 8:30 to 9:15. Hayes had signed for a pizza delivery at 8:50. And the delivery driver remembered him clearly because of his strange insistence on paying the exact amount without a tip. Yet Susan's body showed signs of having been buried with careful deliberation, clothes, smoothed arms, positioned, even small stones arranged around her head like a pillow. This wasn't the frantic work of a killer racing against time and imminent discovery. When Torres shared these concerns with Rosa during a follow-up interview, her response was immediate and emphatic. "Maybe they worked together," she suggested, her eyes bright with the possibility. 3 dangerous men, all with reasons to hurt that sweet child. Perhaps they planned it together. It was a reasonable theory, except for one detail that Torres noticed only later when reviewing the tape. Rosa had suggested collaboration before he'd mentioned the timeline problems, almost as if she'd anticipated his questions. The discovery that changed everything came not from the sheriff's department, but from Dr. Sarah Chen, the jogger who had first spotted Susan's remains. As a forensic anthropologist, she had volunteered to assist with the careful excavation of the burial site, and her trained eye caught what the investigators had initially overlooked. "There's something else here," she called out on the 4th day of excavation, her brush revealing a small object nestled against Susan's collarbone. As the sand fell away, a delicate chain emerged, supporting a smooth seashell pendant no larger than a child's thumb. Detective Torres crouched beside the grave, his pulse quickening as Dr. Chen lifted the necklace with tweezers. The seashell was iridescent, its surface worn smooth by countless tides. But what made Torres's breath catch were the tiny initials carved into its surface, RD. "Do we know anyone with those initials?" Dr. Chen asked, photographing the pendant from multiple angles. Torres felt the ground shift beneath his understanding of the case. Rosa Delgado. The woman who had been present for every development, who had comforted the family through their darkest hours, who had provided such detailed information about the 3 suspects. The woman whose observations had shaped the entire direction of the investigation. He immediately called the Martinez family, now living in San Diego, to ask about the necklace. Mrs. Martinez's voice grew soft with memory when he described it. "Yes, I remember that necklace. Rosa gave it to Susan the day we arrived that summer. She said it had belonged to her grandmother. Rosa gave it to her. She was so sweet about it. Said Susan should have something special to protect her during her time at the beach." Mrs. Martinez paused. "Detective, why would Rosa's necklace be with Susan when she died?" Torres couldn't answer that question yet, but his mind was already racing through the implications. If Susan had been wearing Rosa's necklace when she was killed, it suggested they had been together just before her death. But Rosa had never mentioned seeing Susan on the evening of July 15th beyond their brief exchange at the kitchen window. When Torres pulled the original case files, he found Rosa's statement from 1971. She claimed to have been in the main house all evening, preparing for the next day's laundry and listening to her radio. She hadn't seen or heard anything unusual until Mr. Martinez came looking for Susan around 10 o'clock. Now, with the necklace gleaming under the evidence room's fluorescent lights, that timeline began to crumble like sand in the wind. The investigation into Rosa Delgado began with a single phone call to her former employers in Sacramento. What Detective Torres discovered unraveled 25 years of carefully constructed lies with surgical precision. "Oh yes, we had to let Rosa go," said Margaret Whitfield, Rosa's employer from 1987 to 1994. "Such a shame, really. She seemed so trustworthy at first, but items kept disappearing, small things, valuable things. A silver tea service that had been in my family for generations, some antique jewelry, a few rare books." Similar stories emerged from Rosa's other employers. The pattern was always the same. Rosa would work for affluent families for several years, gaining their complete trust before valuable items began to vanish. She was careful, selective, taking only pieces that might be misplaced or forgotten. By the time families noticed the thefts, Rosa had already moved on with glowing references she had written herself. But the Martinez family had been different. They had employed Rosa for 8 years, longer than any other family. Their beach house, filled with 3 generations of heirlooms, had been Rosa's greatest opportunity and ultimately her downfall. Torres drove to Sacramento to interview Rosa in person, but found her small apartment empty. The landlord said she had left 3 days earlier, claiming a family emergency. Her disappearance might have been the end of the trail, except for a storage unit registered under her name just outside the city. What Torres found inside made his stomach turn. Carefully cataloged and preserved were dozens of items stolen from the Martinez family over the years: silver candlesticks, porcelain figurines, antique photographs, jewelry that Mrs. Martinez had assumed was simply misplaced. Each piece was wrapped in tissue paper and labeled with dates spanning from 1963 to 1971. But it was the journal he found beneath the stolen goods that revealed the full scope of Rosa's betrayal. Written in her careful handwriting were detailed inventories of every valuable item in the Martinez house, complete with estimated values and planned theft dates. The final entry, dated July 15, 1971, contained 3 simple lines that explained everything. "The girl saw me with the jade figurine. She asked too many questions. She cannot be allowed to tell her parents." Below that, in different ink, was what appeared to be a plan: Craig's tools by the cottage, Mark's ring from his jacket pocket, Hayes's papers from under his mattress. They will never suspect. Rosa had not just killed Susan Martinez to protect her secret. She had orchestrated an elaborate frame job to ensure 3 innocent men would bear the blame forever. The final pieces of Rosa Delgado's 25-year deception fell into place with devastating clarity. Security footage from her Sacramento storage facility showed her making regular visits over the decades, adding new stolen items to her carefully curated collection. Phone records revealed she had been tracking news coverage of Susan's case, even calling reporters anonymously to suggest fresh angles that would keep suspicion focused on Craig, Mark, and Hayes. Most chilling of all was the revelation of how perfectly Rosa had positioned herself as the grieving family's confidant. Every tear she had wiped away, every comforting word she had offered, every detail she had provided to investigators, all of it had been calculated manipulation designed to deflect attention from the woman who had spent 8 years systematically looting the family she pretended to love. Detective Torres contacted the 3 men whose lives had been destroyed by Rosa's frame job. Craig Morrison had died in 1987, a broken alcoholic who never escaped the shadow of suspicion. Mark Henley had spent decades in therapy, unable to form lasting relationships because of the cloud that hung over his name. James Hayes, whose real name was Robert Chen Valdez, had served multiple prison sentences for crimes he actually committed, but always wondered if police attention had been heightened because of his connection to the Martinez case. When Torres finally tracked down Rosa in a small apartment in Phoenix, she was 83 years old and suffering from dementia. The woman who answered the door seemed genuinely confused when he mentioned Susan Martinez, her eyes holding the blank innocence of someone whose memories had been erased by time. "I don't remember any little girl," she said, her voice still carrying traces of that musical accent. "I worked for many families. They all loved me like their own grandmother." Even in her diminished state, Rosa clung to the lie that had defined her life. As Detective Torres walked away from that final interview, he looked back at the small apartment where evil had found its retirement. The real journey was just beginning for the families who had spent 25 years wondering. In the end, that was the lesson: evil might hide behind familiar faces, but truth endures even when buried beneath decades of deception. As he drove toward the Martinez family's home to deliver the news in person, Torres squeezed the steering wheel tighter. How do you tell a family their daughter's killer was the woman they trusted most? You tell them the truth, he whispered to himself. And then you help them heal one day at a time.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.